Good evening. I'd like to call the Planning and Economic Development Committee meeting of April 6, 2019 to order. I am Councillor Paul McPherson, and I'm your chair for the committee. I'd like to begin by reading a safety notice. In the event of an emergency, please evacuate council chambers to the nearest exit through the chamber doors and obey all instruction given by the clerk. Trish, raise your hand right here. She's in charge. If assistance is required, please see the clerk. Once you have evacuated the building, please gather in the front parking lot outside of Town Hall. Also, the Town of Lincoln Committee and Council meetings are posted on our YouTube channel. I'd like to thank the public for attending the meeting this evening, and I just want to remind everyone of our rules for engagement, to please be respectful while others are speaking, and to please refrain from clapping. Delegations will have 5 minutes to speak and are asked to stay focused on the agenda item. Please remember to silence all cellular devices. This evening, we have pretty close to a full complement of council. To my far left, representing Ward 4, we have Councillors Timmers and Reimer. Councillor Michaluk from Ward 3, Mayor Easton. Over to my right from Ward 2, we have Councillors Brunet and Pachariva, and from Ward 1, we have Councillor Rajima. This evening, Councillor Russell sends his regrets. We also, in the back tables, we have a full complement of staff here this evening. Are there any declarations of interest? Councillor Reimer.
Thank you, Chair McPherson. On the item of 5.3, PD-24-19, the applicant is a customer of the company that I work for. I'll be declaring interest.
Thank you. So we'll start into presentations, and I would say to all of the council, we have a very, very full agenda tonight, so I'd ask that you keep your questions as tight as you can, and so that we can move through this as well as we can. Thank you. We have a staff presentation on item 5.1, PD 26-19, Prudhoe zoning amendment and draft plan of subdivision. So I'd ask Mr. Bruder and Mr. Kokopoulos to step forward to the podium.
Through you, Mr. Chair, and good evening to members of council that are here this evening, to members of the community that are here this evening as well. And in addition to that, the consulting team and the development team responsible for this particular project. I think it's important just to highlight it is somewhat unorthodox that at this stage in the process that staff are presenting on this particular plan. But again, looking at this project, the magnitude of this project, the significance to the community of this project, we felt that it was important to provide some opening comments before the consultant's presentation moves forward. So Associate Director Bruder and I will be taking you through a few slides in terms of process and where we're at. So in terms of our secondary plan approval, I think one of the things to also highlight that's important is we've been at this process for the better part of almost 2.5 years now in terms of the Prudhoe's development, in terms of fairly unprecedented stakeholder engagement, working with our various communities, not only across Lincoln, but definitely specifically as it relates to Victoria Shores. And let me just pause while we pull it up here for those that are watching. Well, why don't we get going, and I think it is available on this screen, and we will try to get this screen going. As you can see from this slide, transitioning from our secondary plan approval, which did occur last year, we spent the better part of the last number of months, trying to get to where we are right now. And that secondary plan that was completed intended to provide guidance on various areas around land use, public spaces, building heights, the environmental protections that are required and that need to be negotiated. Of course, roads, trails, parks, and public space amenities in more detail. And these are otherwise other things that would be included in the town's official plan. So we have now moved into the development application stage, and Matt's going to take you through that particular piece. We do have submissions from the landowner, accompanied by the various relevant documents, and since that time, we've been working with other key stakeholders, the province on various pieces of this, and so you will hear more about that in the coming presentation.
Thanks, Mike. So, yeah, at this particular point, I thought it would be beneficial to everybody here just to put a little bit of context into where we are in the process. As Mike had stated, we did go through the secondary plan process to kind of add a little bit more detail to the overarching plan that got incorporated into the official plan. Now we've moved forward to the kind of preliminary level in terms of the development, where we look at how the land is going to be subdivided. So the big point of draft plan of subdivision is looking at the road network layout, the block layouts, and how they apply to specific land uses. And then the zoning sets forth further requirements on a block-specific basis. So where we are right now, so obviously we've had the open houses, well attended, good feedback, and now we're in front of you for the public meeting. I would stress that this has been an iterative process where there's been back and forth between us and the developer. We continue to work together, working through feedback we've been getting from stakeholders to date, agencies to date. We'll continue to do so after this. Any input we receive today obviously will be carefully considered, and then we will look forward to try to finalize the draft plan, and that's when we will be coming back with a recommendation, and that will outline the draft plan and draw the preliminary design component to an end. And then after that, we proceed into subsequent things, the site plan, or the subdivision agreement, site plans, condo plans, what have you. And those are where a lot more of the detailed design happens prior to building permit applications. So I kind of already went through this. What the purpose of the draft plan of subdivision is to divide the land into usable blocks and lots for the purpose of development. I'll move on from here. Some of the key aspects of the plan, again, you've been seeing this plan in some variety before you for a while now. Still maintain a large waterfront park at the end of the main street, kind of right at the terminus there, providing a really nice and high-end vista of the lake. We're looking at, again, this is very preliminary now in terms of park design. We're not really there yet. It's more about the land that's been set aside, but obviously, in the consideration of the land that we need, parking provisions are something that we have been considering as we move forward. In terms of active transportation, looking at a waterfront trail as close to the water as design permits. Again, the design for that comes later, but just looking at it on the level of overall connectivity with the site is something that we've been doing now. There's other active transportation features in the plan, on and off street connections that will be included. Range of land uses we're going to be including, obviously. We went through the secondary plan to identify areas for that employment, office type uses, for commercial uses, and then obviously your variety of residential uses as well. And then as we move forward, obviously this being a beautiful piece of land, we want to make sure that we want to look at retention of vegetation where possible, or if not possible, then we look at replanting ratio and ways to go about that. So some of the key issues, connection to Victoria Shores, that remains unchanged. That connection going in there now will be pedestrian and emergency services only. There won't be any other vehicular access through there at this time. Still considering traffic flow, both within and external to the site. That involves ongoing dialogue with MTO, which we are engaging, will continue to engage as we move forward, obviously prior to the recommendation stage. Interfaces with existing residential areas, obviously Victoria Shores being the main residential piece to the west. We want to make sure that the transition there is appropriate. Servicing, there'll be some servicing upgrades that'll be mentioned a little bit later, but in terms of sanitary and upgrading the capacity and storm as well. And then natural environment, like I said, tree protection or replanting. A little bit of an update for the significant wildlife habitat in the environmental impact study that was done. There were 2 kind of candidate protection areas that were noted in the secondary plan, but that concluded that they were not significant wildlife habitat areas. We had some inquiries and changes. A lot of these came out of the open houses. There was some question, I believe from some of you, with respect to the east side and some of the built form that was shown on the plan at the open house. Just wanted to provide a little bit of an update, and John from IBI will be presenting later to this as well, but a mid-rise tower will be included in one of those blocks where it was initially identified. At the open house there was townhomes there, but that's going to be back into a mid-rise. And another notable change that's happened since the open houses is there has been part of the employment area that has been reintroduced, where there was also townhouses proposed. So again, just this note on the bottom, and I think it's important to highlight, is just this draft plan is still being reviewed by staff and agencies. There's still back and forth going on with the interested stakeholders. So following this, as I said, input received will be considered, and if there are any subsequent changes, those will definitely be looked at for sure. So some tentative timelines for you. I talked about the servicing upgrades, the water main, the sanitary force main, the pumping station. The design for all those be happening in 2019. We're looking at likely draft plan approval a little bit later. Like I said, we'll be coming back with a subsequent recommendation report when ready. That'll also be this year. And then there might be some pre-grading and some of the shoreline protection works as well, is something that we may be looking to get going on this year. In 2020, that's when the construction of a lot of the infrastructure, the servicing upgrades will be undertaken. And then we're anticipating the potential for some pre-servicing works as well. And then towards the end of 2020, this is very tentative at this point, as there's a little bit of a ways to go until we get there, but the end of 2020, early 2021, perhaps that's when we start getting into some building permits. So in terms of next steps, as I mentioned, any input received will be considered by us and the applicant. Plans will be updated as required, and then we'll be coming forward with a subsequent recommendation report to bring forward to this committee at a later date.
Thank you, Mr. Bruder and Mr. Kakopoulos. So I will go out to council for any questions, but keep them to this presentation. As Mr. Bruder indicated, there is another fulsome presentation coming from Mr. Arians specific to the property. So if you've got questions about this presentation, you can ask them now. Seeing none, you're done. Thank you. So we're going to move into the statutory public meetings, of which we have 5 public meetings this evening. And just to remind everybody that the purpose of the public meeting is to receive comments from the public and consider questions regarding the Prudhoe zoning amendment and draft plan of subdivision, zoning bylaw amendment application by Kelly and Benjamin Van Hoffen, zoning bylaw amendment application by Kimberly and James Vermeyer, amendment to the zoning bylaw public uses and industrial lands and rural areas community improvement plan. Please be advised, section 1715, 3412, and 5120 of the Planning Act require that before passing a zoning bylaw amendment, Council must ensure that sufficient information and material is available to understand generally the proposal being considered, and council must hold at least one public hearing for the purpose of giving the public an opportunity to make representations regarding the proposed amendment or amendments. If a person or public body does not make oral submissions at a public meeting or make written submissions to the town of Lincoln before the application is passed, the person or public body is not entitled to appeal the decision of town council to the local planning appeal tribunal. Personal information is collected under the authority of the Planning Act and may be contained in an appendix to a staff report published in the meeting agenda, delegation list, and/or the minutes of the public meeting and made part of the public record. The town of Lincoln collects this information in order to make informed decisions on the relevant issues and to notify interested parties of council's decisions. It may also be used to serve notice of a local planning appeal tribunal hearing. Names and addresses contained in submitted correspondence and other information will be available to the public unless the individual expressly requests the town to remove their personal information. The disclosure of this information is governed by the Municipal Freedom of Information and Protection of Privacy Act, RSO 1990, CM 56. We stress that at this point, no decision has been made on the applications, and council will take any comments received into account in their consideration of these items. There is an attendance list by the door, which we would ask all present to sign if they wish to be notified of council's decision. Members of the public are reminded to give their name and address when they speak. If approved by council, a notice of the items passing will be circulated with an appeal period. Our first public hearing is for the purpose of the Prudhome's zoning amendment and draft plan of subdivision. We have one delegation registered this evening with respect to this public hearing. Please note that each delegation may speak for a maximum of 5 minutes. Mr. John Arians from IBI Group, speaking to report PD-26-19, Prudhome zoning amendment and draft plan of subdivision. Mr. Arians, if you would please come forward.
Perfect, thank you.
And Mr. Arians, I would say, and I would ask council's agreement on this for the purpose of this presentation, going beyond 5 minutes. Would I get agreement on that through council? Thank you.
Thank you.
We want you to spend the time we need to get through this in a good fashion.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, Madam Mayor, members of council, ladies and gentlemen. Angela Bonamici is a planner with IBI, and myself, I'm the planning lead of our Hamilton office. Our clients are here as well. We're very excited to be here before you with the draft plan of subdivision and the zoning for what truly has been a very exciting project. We've been involved in the secondary plan for the 2.5 years that it's been underway, and here we are today now with the draft plan of subdivision and the actual zoning bylaw. This slide just shows you the very brief Prudhome's journey. It started with you adopting the secondary plan in April of last year. We had to wait, of course, till the region adopted it before we can file applications, and you can see August 2018, the ink was barely dry when the regional chair signed the official plan amendment, and a month later, we submitted our zoning and draft plan applications in September, right after the August adoption. We then submitted our draft plan in October. It says 2019, but it should actually say 2018. I apologize for that. So as I said, the applications were deemed complete. That means all the requisite studies were prepared, submitted, and filed with the application, and your staff could process it. We had the meeting at Victoria Shores. They were good enough to extend their clubhouse for a site-specific meeting. And at that meeting, we heard a lot of comments, a lot of very positive comments, I could say. In fact, at both the Victoria Shores meeting and the open house meetings that the town had, the primary questions I got is, when are you going to start? And that seemed to be prevalent throughout the community. There's a lot of interest in this particular project. Here we are 6 months from submitting our draft plan applications at a statutory public meeting. And I can tell you, Angela and I have processed many applications in municipalities 10 times bigger than the town of Lincoln, and I cannot get a statutory public meeting in 6 months' time. So Mr. Kirkopoulos, Mr. Bruder, Ms. Shi, they've worked very hard with us. We've had regular meetings. The agencies have been terrific. To bring a draft plan forward to a statutory public meeting like this in 6 months is indeed a very good sign that things are moving well here in the town of Lincoln. The next steps, of course, is that your staff will ultimately prepare a report and that you will be asked to render a decision. We're hopeful that that'll come before the summer of this year so that we can get the draft plan approval in place, start the detailed engineering design over the fall and the winter, and as Mr. Bruder's slides alluded to, hopefully servicing will follow next spring. The IBI group, we've been very fortunate in working with this project. We've been the lead consultants both in planning, engineering, urban design, landscape architecture, transportation, and active transportation. Angela and I have coordinated the entire project. Primarily, our role has been as planning consultants. Tonight, I brought Mr. John Perks. John is a professional engineer. He's a civil engineer. He dealt with pipes and infrastructure and servicing and stormwater management. Mr. Hugo Chan is also with us. He's also a professional engineer, and Hugo is our transportation expert. He's been involved in all the background traffic studies, the active transportation components, and putting together, helping us with, the overall functioning of this draft plan. All four of us are available for questions and answers, and particularly if members of the public have any questions at all about, the Laurie Avenue pumping station, what's happening at this intersection, we're available to answer those. This, of course, is the secondary plan. And you may recall at some of the public meetings, I refer to it as the colored butterfly in the middle, because that's kind of what it looks like. Well, we've taken that secondary plan as the guiding document it's meant to be, and we created our concept plan, which is basically our client's vision for this property, how we see that secondary plan being implemented. And we've got an employment area at the interchange, we've got a commercial area, we've got a main street, a waterfront promenade, a huge waterfront park, and then a complete community with a full range of housing. We've got singles, semis, townhouses, stacked townhouses, back-to-back townhouses, mid-rise apartments, and high-rise apartments. So we truly are creating a very unique, complete community, all tied together with a pedestrian linkage system, walkways, trails, waterfront promenade, active transportation, bike lanes along the service road. So it's a complete community all tied together. This is what is on the agenda tonight. This is a draft plan of subdivision, and what it is really doing, it's cookie cutting these 80 acres into various lots, into various blocks, into various parcels. Some of the parcels are intended for roads, some of the parcels are intended for parks or parkettes, some are blocks of land that will accommodate an apartment building, some are blocks of land that will accommodate townhouses. We've prepared a detailed land use schedule. I think in your staff report it summarizes there's so many singles, so many semis, so many townhouses, so many apartment units. And that's really our best guess at this point. We're simply creating the blocks that can accommodate up to that many homes. The zoning, which is also in front of us, and we'll discuss that in a moment, will actually detail upon these particular blocks, where can you build, how close can you be to the street, to your lot lines, how high can you be, how many parking spots do you need. That's all controlled in the zoning bylaw. So between the draft plan of subdivision and the zoning bylaw, we then create a recipe for moving forward, which will ultimately be implemented in a subdivider's agreement. Ultimately, these blocks, or many of these blocks, will be subject to site plan control. Now, you may recall this drawing. When we appeared before council as part of the secondary plan, our color configuration on our butterfly was slightly different than what the consultants that the town had hired was. And the mayor said, John, We've got the consultant's drawing, we've got your drawing. Prove to us that yours is better. Show us the difference. So we prepared a detailed 3D rendering of the project, and we presented these slides to you, and I'll let Angela take over and just give you an overview of some of those key slides.
All right. So the first one was our gateway feature. This is looking into the main entrance of the subdivision off of North Service Road. So what we envisioned here was a gateway feature that not only was unique from the standard wall features that you see with subdivisions, but also paid respect to the history of the site and its movie and film background. So we wanted to place a marquee on the side of our boutique hotel to welcome people into the Prudhoe subdivision. This is a view looking down Main Street to the waterfront. As you can see, our vision here is to give a full pedestrian-friendly look to the Main Street with 0 lot lines for the storefronts, wider boulevards for pedestrians with strollers, you know, and just walking side by side. Tighter vehicle lanes. We also are proposing that the speed limit down Main Street be 30 kilometers so that we do slow down the traffic going down there. As well, it is a shared bike lane it's actually the only street in the subdivision that we would have a shared bike. It wouldn't be separated. And by lowering the speed limit, that allows for it to, I guess, complement each other. We also have various street trees, and we propose these removable bollards, which in the winter would be removed to allow for parking right up to the shop storefronts. And in the summer, you'd place the bollards in, and you can expand the patio space for whatever storefront's there. And then we have also different road material to distinguish, kind of give that village appeal of Main Street and make it more welcoming to pedestrians. This is our view of the waterfront, which I will say has changed significantly with talks with town staff as to the size of the park and what is envisioned for the park. The main points to take from here is we will still have a separated bike lane and multi-use trail away from the waterfront promenade street. There will be more green space than what we show on this plan. There'll be on-street parking, another thing that isn't shown. But the thing is, with the town, we will have a more flexible design as to the park. So where it is, look like stones right now against the water, there will all be more green space, and the waterfront park has expanded from what we currently show. But to keep it flexible, because the design is not there, it allows for us to work with the town as to what they want and what amenities they do want into that park. This view is along the adjacent neighborhood of Victoria Shores, where that naturalized channel runs along their property. What you see here is we would propose a walking path for all pedestrians, add more plantings, and as well we would provide upgraded finishes on the rear yard to maintain the aesthetically pleasing streetscape for the existing homeowners of Victoria Shores. So I think that's it for my portion.
So as Ange has indicated, the actual slides that we prepared were based on the original concept, and significant changes have occurred. So as you can appreciate, the cost and the expense of upgrading that 3D perspective is quite significant. This is the zoning map, and you see the large amount of green space along the water's edge. There's a hazard land zoning, and then there's going to be an open space zoning. And that's going to be your new municipal park, that lighter green color. There are a number of different zoning categories that are going to be requested as part of the implementing bylaws, dealing with, you know, the sizing of the residential lots and blocks, the placement of buildings on the various lots and blocks, the height permissions that the secondary plan incorporates. All of that will be captured in the zoning bylaw. So tonight we are proposing the actual lotting patterns, and then the zoning will provide the planning permissions and restrictions applicable to each of the individual parcels. There is also going to be a phased implementation of the Prudhome's plan. And we've identified a number of phases corresponding to how we see the market unfolding, and certainly the central portion, which includes the municipal park along the water's edge, is going to be the first phase. So you're going to get your park right at the beginning. And we look forward to working with the town in developing that park, because it's obviously in our clients' interest to have a ready-to-go park, because that attracts new home buyers and new purchasers. So it's a win-win situation for the developer and the municipality, having the park in the first phase, together with the Main Street and the Main Street amenities and roundabout there. The subsequent phases are basically going to be market-driven. If you ask me how long is it going to take to finish Prudhome's, I'm going to say, well, how long is a piece of string? You know, we don't know at this point. It depends on the market. The residential market is somewhat softened lately. I have a number of projects in Grimsby in the Casablanca area, and that market has slowed down. Will it affect Prudhome's? I don't know, but regardless, we need to be ready. We need to keep moving forward with our planning approvals, and the market will take care of itself, as it always does. Now, from a servicing perspective, the main components we dealt with are grading, and obviously we have to match the grades around the perimeter of the site. All the existing property lines have to be matched. Sanitary infrastructure is a key component, and earlier I mentioned that at the open house and at the Victoria Shores meeting, the rebuilding of the pumping station was a major concern, and residents had issues about what kind of disruption would it cause in their neighborhood, and will a larger pumping station cause additional odors or any problems? And we tried to address those comments as best we could. Water mains need to be extended. We're working closely with the regional municipality to deal with the extension of water mains. And stormwater management has really been a unique attribute of this development. We're proposing something called low-impact development standards. And low-impact development means we don't do conventional storm sewers and conventional stormwater management ponds, which unfortunately many municipalities fence. We're doing infiltration galleries. We're doing trees with silva cells, which hold water and provide nourishment and moisture for the trees in the boulevard. So rather than a sewer pipe taking water away, the water is directed into these series of tree cells to help the vegetation grow. And we've done a lot of research on these silva cells, and we see subdivisions without them and subdivisions with them, with trees planted at the same time. And with the silva cells, the trees are 3 times as big, and they're certainly more healthy and more prosperous. So it's a unique way of treating storm water as a design feature and as a landscaping feature. There was concern over the west drainage channel, and this is the drainage channel that separates us from Victoria Shores. And a portion of that drainage channel is going to be channelized, and a portion of it is going to be naturalized. And I'll just quickly go to, I'll go to this slide, and I don't know if there's no cursor I can use here. But basically, the channel around Victoria Shores will be naturalized. Okay, if you look at that L, that part will be naturalized. It's from that channel to the North Service Road, going through that employment and townhouse block. That's where it has to be piped. And in fact, we're picking it up from a culvert underneath the interchange. So it's already a piped water course. We're simply extending that pipe through a parking area, because otherwise it would create 2 separate blocks which are separated, and we don't get access to the one block. So just a short section of that channel will be piped, and the balance of it, certainly around the perimeter by Victoria Shores, will be fully naturalized with plantings, and as Angela indicated, trails and walkways and trees will be part of the landscape component. It's only a very small section that needs to be channelized. From a transportation impact and transportation demand and active transportation, there are improvements that are going to be initiated to the South Service Road and the QEW. We've suggested some improvements in our traffic studies. Those still need to be vetted through the MTO and the region. We're confident that we have a solution that'll work to everyone's best interest. It's just working with the agencies now to give them a level of comfort. Our Main Street corridor, as Angela indicated, will be used for moving traffic and also for stopping traffic and slowing it down. With the use of the bollards, we'll be able to either have patios right up to the street edge or open it up for parking, or completely close the street from the roundabout to the waterfront park to have a street festival. I mean, we're creating that community of several thousand homes, several thousands of people. They want to have the opportunity, or we think they need to have the opportunity to close that main street. Cycling, pedestrian facilities, the multi-use trails, these have all been incorporated into the redevelopment. And of particular interest is that waterfront promenade. The waterfront is not going to be hidden behind a bunch of buildings. The waterfront is going to be on the entire north side of that Lakeshore Road. Think of Spencer Smith Park when you're driving into downtown Burlington, and it's right there. You know, that's the view we want to do. We want to create that Spencer Smith. And in fact, the land area that we're proposing in Prudhome's is larger than Spencer Smith Park in Burlington. That's where they have the Jazz Festival. That's where they have Rib Fest. Think of all the wonderful facilities and entertainment we can have in our waterfront promenade. We're also looking at Niagara Rideshare, and we're looking at carpool parking, all incorporating that in. And our roads are going to be designed to accommodate future transit. You know, it has to be a complete community with transit availability. We need to be able to get buses in there at some future date as the demand warrants. The park block, I've talked a lot about it. You're going to be getting over 1 kilometer of waterfront shore. And of course, that shoreline has to be protected. We've submitted plans and drawings to the ministry. That will allow us to capitalize on those wonderful views of the lake, views of Toronto, of Mississauga. It's going to be just tremendous. We'll have the trail, we'll have a plaza. It'll be fully accessible. And we've come up with some concept plans for the waterfront park. Your own staff have come up with theirs. You have total design flexibility. There's over 12 acres of municipal parkland along that waterfront. Now, some of it, admittedly, is hazard land. But when you're at the Jazz Festival in Spencer Smith Park, are you on the hazard land or are you on the parkland? It makes absolutely no difference where the line is because it's such a nice, smooth, gentle transition to the waterfront edge. That's how we envision this park. Yes, there is an official hazard land, but for all intent and purposes, it's one smooth plane right to the shoreline protection. You cannot tell whether you're on the hazard land or you're on the parkland. There's absolutely no difference. So you have detailed design flexibility on this wonderful park feature. So this is our concept plan. We're very excited. We're very proud of it. We look forward to submitting it to the region for Urban Design Awards when we do have the approvals in place. And other than that, Mr. Chairman, members of council, we're here to answer any questions. And if members of the public have concerns or issues, please invite us back to the podium and we'll gladly address those as well. Thank you.
Thank you, John and Angela. Turn on our mic. Thank you, John and Angela. So I will now turn it over to the council for questions. Councillor Mikulik.
Thank you, Chair McPherson. Through you to the presenter. It is a beautiful plan. I may possibly be living there one day myself. Compliment you on that. Just some technical questions regarding stormwater and sewer discharge management. The data that you use, the studies you base that, what data do you base that off of?
So could you clarify, through the chair, if you could clarify, what do you mean by what data? Like the 100-year storm, the
Yeah,
50-year
like-
storm?
Yeah.
Okay. John, can
That
you
sort of
answer that,
thing.
please?
How, like, basically, how current is that data? Or are we using old numbers? Are we using old data that's outdated due to the amount of rain that we've had in the recent years?
Right, so the question is with regard to the soil cells and the treatment for it. That's what I'm understanding. The quantity control is not an issue on the site because we're so close to the lake. So quantity control is not needed. We just, the water can go at whatever rate into the lake, and that's what we do. So quantity is not an issue. It's more the quality control and capturing that sort of first flush of rainfall that's important, because that's the dirtiest water. That, when the rain first starts, that's the first inch of water that is the dirtiest, and that's the water you want to capture and infiltrate and clean up before it discharges into the lake.
And then just another question, with regards to the grading of the proposed subdivision or plan of subdivision, there should be no negative impacts faced by Victoria Shores through a higher level of grading. There should be no negative impact.
That's
Am
correct.
I correct?
That's correct, yeah.
Okay. And then these silva cells that I've never heard of these silva cells. Are they factored into the calculation for the discharge amount, or either retention or discharge?
Certainly. As I say, you're looking for that first flush of water when it first rains to capture that and treat that. And there'd be calculations that address that and ensure that it's sized properly to treat that water.
And they would be in addition to or supplementary to what's proposed currently, or are they're included in the calculation?
So if I can add, our landscape architects have been, deeply involved in the design of the low-impact development standards. And instead of piping the water to a bathtub, which is the conventional way, picture every tree as being a tiny tub onto itself. So the water gets discharged into these cells of trees. There will also be bioswales within the development, bioswales in the park area, all designed to capture that water, deal with that first flush, or as John referred to it, and then discharge it directly to the lake. Discharge, like the lake has got ample capacity, so the quantity is not a concern. We just need to clean it, use it for our purposes as best we can. There'll be storage within parking lots underground in the different egg cartons or plastic pipe that the engineers have come up with. So it's a very low impact design for stormwater management, as opposed to the conventional pipe it, capture it, then let her go.
Okay, and then, thank you, Mr. Chair, and if I could ask one more question regarding, like, when I see these drawings and I see these conceptual drawings, they're always taken on a spring or summer day. And now, the concern I have is with regards to snow and snow management. That's all, I'm gonna assume that this is we would, as a town, assume the roads, and we would be responsible for maintaining the roads. But the snow has been all factored, that's all been calculated, and maybe staff might be able to answer that question better.
That through the chair, that certainly, winter maintenance is a concern. We do have, that major season to deal with in this climate. All of our Main Street promenade, those bollards can move in and out. So in the wintertime, the bollards move out, allowing for snow storage at the side of the roads, because no one's out in those patios. In the summertime, the bollards can move back in. We've designed parking lots with snow storage areas. Obviously, the homeowners take care of their own shoveling, but the driveways are spaced so that there's room. So, winter maintenance has been incorporated into the design.
Okay, that's good. Thank you very much.
You're welcome, sir.
Councillor Rajima.
Thank you, Chair McPherson. I want to compliment you on the urban design, part of the urban design, and the way that the streets have a natural curve to them, because I know that's a natural traffic calming effect, and think things weren't always done that way, so I like to see that. And I have a question about, so you're talking about promoting walkability and that you're going to be providing the ability for public transit to make its way around here. Has there been talks with MTO and possibly providing somewhere for a GO bus stop in the future? I think this may have come up in the past, but I don't recall the answer. And I'm looking particularly at the final phase lands down there. I think there's lands down there that aren't owned by the developer. That might be a good place to provide a GO bus stop.
If I may, that may be a staff response to that question.
Through you, Mr. Chairman, thanks for the opportunity. Councillor, we have discussed, staff and myself are meeting on a regular basis with our counterparts at Metrolinx on a number of developments. One of the conversations we've had in the past is, I think, highlighting the importance of prudums to them and the possibility in the future of looking at transit and transit accommodations, both within prudums but also directly adjacent to the Prudhoe subdivision, similar to what we have here in Beamsville in terms of the existing park and ride facility that's there. So definitely something on the radar, and I think as we move forward, something that we'll have more conversations with the team at Metrolinx about.
Okay.
If you look at the cursor on the drawing, there's a large commercial area which certainly is capable of accommodating a bus coming in and out and picking up people, dropping them off, and off to Toronto they go. So, you know, there's opportunities within the commercial area as well.
Okay, and that's phase, what phase is that? Looks like phase 4.
Phase 4, yeah.
Phase 4, okay. That's all my questions, thank you.
Mary Easton.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, John, and also to the staff. As a big project like this goes along, you wonder what you're winning and what you're losing sometimes. And I was really pleased to see the park area blocked out in that way. It certainly gave it a totally different perspective. The responsibility to build the waterfront, do I understand that 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 would be one of the first things that you would be doing is putting up the break wall and the shoreline protection? Is that correct?
Through the chair, you're absolutely correct, Madam Mayor. Shore protection is an integral part of the redevelopment of this parcel, and your subdivision agreement will certainly require the developer to be responsible for that. And then he has the pleasure of dedicating that land to the town.
Absolutely.
So, win-win.
Good. When you were asking or answering Councillor Mikulic's question in regard to the snow removal, I understand there's going to be more than one condominium association within this plan. Is that correct?
Through the chair, we expect that each block could be its own separate condominium. Within a block with multiple buildings, it could be a phased condominium that ultimately will be joined as one. But potentially, you know, if there's 12 blocks of mid-rise, they could be 12 separate condominiums. But much like Victoria Shores, I would anticipate that these residents would form a neighborhood association to kind of tie the whole community together as well.
Okay. And in keeping with the desire of the municipality to maintain very strong communication with its residents, sometimes we find when there are multiple condominium associations that it's not as easy to communicate, not easy to send out a mailing. So should we expect that with the controls that the owners are placing on the quality of the work that's going to be done, that the condo association, although there may be multiples of them, that the ownership would remain with the owner of the property, with the owners of the entire property?
Unfortunately, Madam Mayor, it doesn't work that way. If you look at the fairgrounds property, there's a couple of condominium blocks within the fairgrounds. they are no longer tied to Mr. DeSantis in any way, shape, or form. Mr. DeSantis built the townhouses, built the roads, did the landscaping, turned it over to his purchasers, who elected a board of directors for their own condominium. There's a treasurer, president, vice president, and they run the show now. Mr. DeSantis is no longer involved. So similarly here, our clients would no longer be involved once the units are built and the condos are registered.
Okay, so the question about snow removal or garbage removal for that matter, the integrity of that is very much tied to the quality of the work done by those individual associations.
And through the chair, yes, but the work starts with the design team to design that townhouse block, to have adequate parking, to have adequate snow storage, to have a loading zone, to have proper landscaping, so that when you, the town, approves that site plan, all of those components are already built in, and the condo corporation simply carries on.
Okay. Mr. Chairman, I have other questions, but I'm going to just ask one more. Others will probably be picked up by my colleagues. I want to talk about heights again. I may be the only person that's interested in this. However, I am interested to know whether or not there is still an opportunity to have a much higher building on the east side.
Through the chair, the zoning bylaw that is before you has a maximum height, I believe, for that block.
Yes.
If council wants to make it higher, you can make it higher.
Okay. And should I assume from that that it is not the intention of the owners to come forward with increased height?
We're satisfied with the height permissions that the secondary plan has identified, but again, the secondary plan has a degree of flexibility. If council wants to pass a bylaw prescribing a minimum or a maximum height, you have every authority to do so.
Right. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Councilor Brunet.
Thank you, Chair McPherson. Through you to Mr. Arians and Angela. So I just want to be clear, at the public meeting at the Fleming Center a few weeks ago, I was heavily engaged in some conversations with Angela, with Melissa, and with the developer. But I understand there might be some changes from that night to this evening and what we're looking at. So I just want to be clear, if you could just clarify for me. So in Phase 2, in blocks 6 through 10, what changes are we looking at tonight that was different from the public meeting, if any?
I'll let Ange explain that.
All right, so in phase 2, which is the magenta color on the map, what we had, block 8 used to be a row of townhouses, standard townhouses, and a row of stacked townhouses.
It's right here, right?
Yes.
So where the cursor is, there's now a 6-story apartment building.
It's block.
Block 7.
Block 6. Where's that block 7?
It's the middle one, block 7, correct?
It's block 7 and 6.
Block 7 and 6 remain the same as, okay, so it changed before. So block 6, yes. So this first changed here. We had a smaller park, which it's flipped to singles, and we had 3 of these buildings that ran north-south configuration. That changed into 1 mid-sized tower, and then a block of standard townhouses here, and then a row of singles along the waterfront. Over here, we had 3 higher-rise, smaller buildings that kind of resembled this size of building at the edge. That, in turn, changed to singles along the waterfront. We had then changed it to a row of standard towns, and we also had a row of standard towns along here, and a row of stacked towns along Street D. From the open house meeting and what we heard from there, we then changed this block 8, from the standard towns that we put in and the stack to a 6-story building.
Okay, thank you. So I've got
Sorry.
that.
Yeah.
So now if we could move over to I guess, what will be future Phase 5, blocks 28, 29, and 30. So what's changed, if anything, from the public meeting in that block? In that phase?
So what we first started off with was a variety of employment buildings that were going to look like townhouses, something that is shown in the city of Mississauga. So they look like townhouse units, but they're office buildings. That's what we proposed. We had originally. That was changed then to the standard townhouse units along the Victoria Shores interface. We then had more standard townhouses over here, back-to-back units, and standard towns along the North Service Road. We maintained an employment building here and here, and so instead of multiple two-story, three-story office buildings, we've now increased these buildings to kind of just join them, and now they're 5-story buildings. So we kind of just merged them into 2 smaller buildings. From then the open house, it was then we revised it to add a 3rd building so that we can gain more employment lands, but we just kind of compacted them instead of the townhouse facades that we had for the employment offices.
Okay, thank you for that clarification. So just when you talk, define employment lands for me, just so I understand that we're on the same page.
Yeah. So in terms of what we're doing here, it would be a prestige industrial zone, which is more of an office type use. These aren't factories. These aren't heavy industrial uses. These are, say research offices or like planning and engineering offices, uses like that, medical offices, clinics. They don't get into the obnoxious uses that the standard industrial employment use gives. This is more of a quieter office business park, if you will.
If I can use the examples of what Lozani has been building in Stony Creek area, whether you like that purple and black colored building or not, it's that type of use. It's prestige, office, service, commercial. Maybe you get a flooring guy in there or carpeting or, Corian countertops, whatever. But it's that kind of service, commercial, warehousing, office type use that we envision at the Prudhome's Business Park as well.
Thank you very much.
Mr. CAO would like to also comment.
Through Mr. Chairman, I think I just want to interject at this point because staff did have a lengthy conversation on this, and I want to point out that Block 31 and 13 that are on either side of Street A are what we deem commercial, and I think for us we had a long conversation internally because I think some municipalities look at commercial and see that as employment, but we've definitely separated what is kind of employment from that prestige industrial standpoint from commercial. So a large section of that corridor along the North Service Road will remain in that employment land designation and then followed by interfacing with commercial as we head easterly.
Mr. Chair, can I ask just one more question?
You've got the mic.
Thank you. So through you to the presenter, so I think Councillor Rinjema just briefly touched on it, but what is classified here as the final phase, I guess the ESSO lands. So like I keep seeing on drawings that it says not included in the development. So what does that mean? Because I'm hearing that it could be part of the development if these lands get purchased. So just a clarification on that.
So in a perfect world, ESSO would more or less realize that no one is interested in that property except our clients. There's the ESSO property, and surrounding that is an MTO strip of land. MTO is certainly a willing vendor. ESSO was a willing vendor. We were negotiating an offer of purchase with ESSO. Our cleanup estimate was quite significant. They could not come to terms on a price, so that's why they decided to put the sign on the property and they listed it. There's been no interest in it other than our clients, so we anticipate that Esso will come back to us, and ultimately that'll become part of the Prudhom's land holdings and be developed. That's why it's shown as a final phase. Our plan can completely go around them and leave them be, so that should some other interest acquire them, it has development potential, but that development potential would be maximized by putting these two properties together.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Councilor Pachariva.
Thank you, Chair McPherson. Thanks, John. Thanks, Angela, very much. Just a couple questions, and just kind of taking on what Councilor Brunet was going down, and I appreciate the changes from the public meeting that you've come to. But having said that, how close are we to final? Only because I don't want to, like, you know, the project is transformational. You know, Ontario's long-term prosperity and the town of Lincoln's prosperity. You know, environmental health and social well-being, all of those good buzzwords. And I think we've all bought in, but then we had some reservations when we saw the changes. So now we've seen some additional changes, and I don't want to go through the fairgrounds again. I don't want to go through where there was a vision and we were going to have seniors buildings, and then it became a sea of towns and you name it. So how close are we to this is going to be it?
So through the chair, this is our best efforts as to this is going to be it.
Okay.
Okay? Real estate is a dynamic industry. Market forces are constantly shifting. Our clients have done extensive research, and that's what prompted some of those changes initially. But we're quite confident that what we have here will be the final product.
Okay.
Will there still be tweaking? Will a 18-story building be 20 stories, or will it be 16 stories? Ultimately, you will decide that as we go down the site plan process.
Okay.
But other than that, this is it.
Okay. And I mean, I understand that. I mean, you know, there was a couple things my father drilled into my head growing up. 50% of nothing is nothing, and profit's not a dirty word. So I get it. But knowing that the development is phased, you know, and the, you know, the block with the employment lands, that might fully revert back to complete employment lands. Because I think conceptually, like, and again, maybe I'm altruistic, maybe I'm pie in this blue sky. But I think if you build it, they will come. And I don't, you know, the market is the market, but if it's something that's all tied together, rather than, I don't want to name towns, and I won't do that, but if it's more hodgepodge, I think that's where you get that, you know, the market fluctuations. But if you build something, like you say, that people are waiting for, that there's a lot of buzz about, that it's the last true open space.
The definition of planning is that we manage change. If there was no change, we don't need to plan to accommodate it. I'm old enough to have designed large subdivisions with school sites, only to go back 20 years later and close that school.
Yeah.
You know, like, things change. And you know, the idea is to come up with a complete community, and 15 years from now, there may be some aspects of this which some other developer or some other builder may come to you and say, yeah, you know, Arians and Bonamici had a great concept, but this is now the way we want to proceed. And this council, or whoever the council will be, will have to make those decisions. But I think we're there.
Okay. So do I.
Mr. Bruder.
Yeah, just to dovetail in there with what Mr. Arians was saying, you know, when we developed this secondary plan, we developed it obviously with some room to provide some level of flexibility as time goes on, realizing that this is a multi-phase, you know, longer-term development. That said, like I mentioned before, we're going to be going away after this, considering what we've heard. Our intention is to come forward with a draft plan at the recommendation stage that doesn't need to keep being revisited in terms of new processes and things like that. So that's the idea, and that is why we build some level of flexibility into the secondary plan as well.
Councillor Timmers.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Through you to Mr. Arians and Angela, thank you very much. Just a couple of quick questions regarding the 1 acre of lake frontage. So from what I understand, that will be part of the phase 1. Will we be able to have access to that lakefront early on? Because this is going to take a long time to build this out. So is that the plan, to get that core done and be able to access the lakefront?
So through the chair, I think that's in all of our interest. As I said before, a developer, a smart developer who has a park in his or her subdivision will develop that park on day one, because that helps sell his or her homes, right? So having 10, 12 acres of waterfront park, and having that park maybe not fully developed, but certainly having the grass down, some play equipment, the trail along the water's edge, that'll go a long way in selling these homes. So I think we're all in sync that we want to get that park in and to a certain level right away.
Okay, very good. I thought I heard that, but I just wanted to hear it
Yep.
again. Just through you to the chair, I have a couple other questions. The hazard area, I'm just curious, is that due to possible erosion? Is that why it's classed as a hazard area? And what
So-
does that mean?
So through the chair, the ministry requires us to stay away from hazardous conditions. And a steep slope is a hazardous condition. A steep slope along a water's edge is even more hazardous because of the wave uprush. So we build a revetment wall. And that wall, we're supposed to protect for 100 years. Now, if the erosion rate was 1 meter a year, our development would have to be set back 100 meters. So by building a revetment wall, we're able to come closer, because that wall has a built-in lifespan. So it's a formula based on the sensitivity of the slope, the amount of waves, the storm events, the type of structure, that ultimately lets us build closer. So somewhere is a magic line that says, from here on in, it can be open space, but from here, it's considered hazardous because, you know, that wall may fail or have issues and needs to be rebuilt. But as I said, when you look at Spencer Smith Park, that hazard line is about halfway from the water's edge to Lakeshore Road. Yet it's a nice, smooth, gentle landing all the way down. You can't tell where the hazard land is. To someone going there, it's all parkland. And that's how we want this perceived. It's all
Okay.
parkland.
Thank you. I just wanted to be clear on that, and I just have 2 more questions, kind of relating. You know, there's a lot of environmental conservation lands within this development. So I know there's going to have to be setbacks from those lands. Can you just touch on that, on how we're addressing those sensitive areas?
So the 3 sensitive areas where the cursor is now kind of east of Victoria Shores was a treed area. In this location was a treed area, and then we have the water course entering the lake over here. Of the 3 areas, only the water course was really identified as being environmentally sensitive or significant. None of the other 2 areas had species at risk, had environmental features, were wetlands, habitat for endangered species, migratory bird stopovers. None of those factors, we didn't get any check marks in those boxes. So those 2 areas, even though they were identified as potential environmental areas in the secondary plan, the studies have proven that they're not. So really, the focus of any environmental protection is on the watercourse area and only that. And again, we have a steep slope, we have a top of bank, we have a setback, then a buffer, and then development.
Very good. And sorry, Mr. Chair, I just have one more that
Go ahead.
I have to ask. In 2018, the Heritage Committee identified 3 buildings, 3 historical buildings on this property. And the 3 historical structures are the brick house, the large wooden barn, and the wooden workers' home. And I'm just wondering if you could just comment on those three structures.
So
What
you
the
can
plan
see
is.
on the slide, here we go, there's the brick house being restored. The workers' home that's here, you may recall when we did the secondary plan, we actually suggested picking that up and moving it into your park block as either a washroom or a change room or something along those lines. The barn, unfortunately, we just can't move it. We don't know what to do with it. It will likely be demolished.
I think with the outcome, the Heritage Committee was hoping to at least document it.
Of
And have
course.
photos.
Of course,
But
yes.
maybe that can be another discussion.
So through the chair, that would typically be a condition of draft plan approval, that prior to any demolition, proper photo documentation and measurements and whatever else. And, you know, we tend to donate those beams to, you know, the Habitat Restore or something like that so that they are reused and recycled. So we'll certainly do our best efforts.
Okay, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Councilor Reimer.
Thank you, Chair McPherson. Through yourself to the presenters, thank you for coming tonight. A question regarding shoreline protection. I'm assuming you're aware we're engaged as a town in a study with Brock University and MEOPAR, shoreline protection, climate, the effects of the climate change and that kind of thing. And I realize it's too early to probably integrate or add any findings from that study. But if further down the road repair or improvements or additions or that kind of thing would needed to be done or would wanted to be done, is there any thought been given to in the design to service corridors or an access or is there any place to get to that work?
Through the chair, there's obviously two ways to repair shore protection. One is to bring a barge in and do it from the water's edge, and the other is overland. There will be absolutely no obstructions to overland access. I mean, it's a kilometer of shoreline that's totally wide open. So if you need to bring a mini excavator or some type of equipment, you know, we have the ability to do that. I think the professor that heads that program was at the Jordan Fire Station open house, and I had a long discussion with her about the program at Brock, and we agreed to exchange information, and our shore consultant will be in touch with her, and, you know, we look forward to working with that group on
Oh,
this.
that's good to hear.
Yeah.
Good to hear. And one other question, if I may, Chair McPherson.
Sure.
On page 15, just to pique my interest, what is a spring seasonal wind study assessment?
So through the chair, it's an assessment we had to do. Here in Niagara Peninsula, we have the unique microclimate between the escarpment and the lake. That keeps the buds from blossoming too early, and it just creates that wonderful climate. So we had to make sure if we're putting up a wall of high-rise buildings that the wind patterns remain the same so that the farmer on the opposite side of the QE doesn't lose his or her crop. So it's that type of an assessment, getting right down to the microclimate and wind impacts of this development. So that was the spring study for microclimate, and we also looked at wind assessment for our downtown promenade to make sure that we're not creating, you know, a wind tunnel effect, and that the area will be conducive to patios and bistros and outdoor street festivals.
And which organization or which body was asking for that information or asking for that
The
assessment?
town asked for that, didn't they, Ange?
Okay.
Okay, so we came up with that ourselves, sorry.
All right. No, that's good. That's it. Thank you very much.
You're
Okay, this is a very important public meeting, and so we are going to allow for second questions, and we're going to start with Mr. Mikulik.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Through you to the presenters, thanks for your time again. Just with regards to the commercial aspect of this development being viewed as Phase 4, have you had any interest? I know you've had plenty of interest with regards to the residential aspect of this development. Have you had much commercial interest in this development to date?
Well, through the chair, it's identified as Phase 4, knowing that, you know, as the residential market unfolds and there's a demand for more commercial, it may get bumped up a little bit as well. Almost immediately, you'll see Tim's and Subway's relocate. Almost immediately, you'll see a new, like a gas bar facility there as well. We have a large building capable of accommodating a Shoppers Drug Mart, capable of accommodating a small Fortino's grocery store. We have all kinds of CRU space available. So, you know, as the residential market builds, that commercial space will get absorbed. Ultimately, it'll be completed likely around, you know, the fourth phase, but you'll see a transition of commercial uses throughout the entire life of the project from start to finish.
And thank you, like, through you, Mr. Chair, just further to Councillor Patria's concern, like, I just would hate to see the commercial, like, we're a town that, you know, we're short in supply of commercial real estate or property. I would hate to see that commercial take a back seat in fulfillment of satisfying the quick buck with residential, and
No,
a
and-
concerted effort to market that commercial would be taken into account.
No,
with this
absolutely,
development.
and through the chair, I mean, the commercial is probably more lucrative than the residential. When you consider, you know, residential land at so much an acre versus commercial at 3 times that per acre. Commercial is also long-term tenancy for our clients. We also have, you know, the Main Street area along here as being phase 1, and Main Street will have shops and retail as well, and restaurants and the little bistros and you know, the wine bar, the restaurant at the corner here. All of that is part of phase 1. And you have to remember, like, a phasing plan gives us an idea as to how it will unfold, how the jigsaw puzzle fits together, but little bits and pieces will go independent of that too.
Yeah, through, it's just with regards to that phase 4, I'd really like to see that, you know, take off quicker. That's all, thank you.
Mayor Easton.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Clearly, John, your team and working with the staff are keeping all of these details in mind, and I'm very pleased that you didn't forget that at one of the very first meetings that we had, we talked about the loss of peach and cherry orchards on the south side. So thank you very much for that. Have you taken into consideration the merits of geothermal? You don't want to talk about
No, I was waiting for your question to finish.
my question?
Yes, and I'm really excited because we're actually considering a lake-based water heating and cooling system. New Horizon Homes is one of my main clients, and we're doing a huge waterfront development off Green Road in Stony Creek. Mr. DeSantis has about 350 units. New Horizon has about 2,000 units, and we're investigating a lake-based heating and cooling plant, which is better than geothermal.
Excellent.
So yes, geothermal is a possibility, but my God, we got this huge body of water
Yeah.
that is even better. So we're starting to investigate those options as well.
Right, so Mr. Chairman, I think this is so important because this is really what's going to separate this development from, you know, the hundreds and hundreds of other houses that are being built. And John, will it make a difference then, going back to the snow removal? When you implement that technology, will there be an improvement, will there be an increase in the ambient temperature of the ground and the area in the central part at all that would assist with snow melt?
Through the chair, I'm not aware of whether or not, you know, the heating duct will also run under a sidewalk and keep a sidewalk clear. I don't know if we can do that because obviously we want to capture that heat for our buildings, not necessarily the infrastructure, but I suppose that's an option. I did the district heating plant in downtown Hamilton, and Mr. Kirkopoulos is probably familiar. Hamilton Energy owns it. It's attached to the Sir John A. Macdonald School, and it's a cogen unit with a you know, a steam engine basically, and it sends heating and cooling to Hamilton Place, City Hall, about 5 or 6 government buildings in downtown Hamilton, and we've got the lines going all over the place, but they're not really used for snow clearing purposes. They're there to heat and cool buildings primarily. But that was 15 years ago we did that project, and I'm sure the technology has changed. So that's definitely something I will bring up with our consulting team.
And will it have a bearing on the cost for the people that live in this subdivision? Will it, or in this complex, will it have a bearing on their costs?
Through the chair, I expect it'll have a significant bearing in that it allows us to provide heating and cooling more efficiently, more naturally, more sustainably, and obviously at a reduced cost and reduced maintenance and upkeep. Instead of having, if we've got 2,000 units here, instead of having 2,000 furnaces and 2,000 air conditioners, if it's all done in one central plant, like that's huge, huge savings. And our goal is to create a sustainable community here. We've got, stormwater, leading-edge stormwater management happening. So it makes sense that we have some kind of district heating and cooling as well.
Right. Mr. Chairman, we talked about the connection to Jordan Harbor in the early days. I realize that the Jordan Harbor project is something that we'll be working with the Conservation Authority on. However, it seems to me that there was a connection under the highway. Were you able to establish that in fact that existed? And is it part and parcel of what's going on here so that we can make those connections later?
Through the chair, there is an underpass about where my cursor is now, going underneath the Queen Elizabeth Highway. It's a tunnel that's about 7 feet tall, maybe 6 feet wide. It's also used as a drainage course. I would not recommend that for pedestrian access. I don't think it's safe. It's not, conducive for, kids or someone out at night walking alone. We've provided a trail terminus right here, and obviously the lake house can take it further east, and it can continue as far as it possibly can. I think the ultimate solution would be some kind of pedestrian bridge over the QE rather than using that existing tunnel. I think a bridge would be cheaper than putting in a new tunnel.
Right, okay. All right, well, Mr. Chairman, the last thing that I would say is that I think we do need to exercise some caution when we're developing the commercial elements, Mr. Chairman, so that we avoid pulling a business from Vineland. And so the scale of things in this complex needs to be very finitely established. And I'm going to go back to the very, very first presentation that was done by one of the consultants. And he showed the diagram of walking, the big bike and walking path, whatever it was, it was this huge rectangle that took us right up into Vineland. And it was so desirable. And of course, now that the market conditions will start to change and we'll be, working hopefully with the owner of the properties along a number 8 highway, this is really the sensitive time when we need to make sure that we do everything we can to complement this and to enhance it to the greatest ability that we can, because it is going to be very special. But at the same time, we want Vineland to have the ability to really have that robust core economy, not just for Vineland, but for Jordan, which is more specialized in boutique, and also for Beamsville. So do you have any comments about that, and are you thinking about that?
I think what's important here is that we've created this active transportation community with trails and walkways and biking. And that's great as long as you're staying in Prudhoe, but connected elsewhere, and to do that loop that you mentioned, I was at that team meeting, and Mr. was it Greenspan or Greenberg? I forget the gentleman's name. That was his idea and his vision. So we're providing a destination place here. It's up to council really to make those connections and to make those connections work. So we've provided them within our 80 acres and our kilometer of shore. Now it's up to you to really extend those.
And so, Mr. Chairman, I'm always pushing, but I'm looking to make sure that we are conscious of the fact that we want this balance amongst all of our communities. And we have this opportunity now with Vineland, who has really been in a situation where they, there's not much that could happen there until this market really started to get going. So I just want to make sure that we're on the same page so that everybody can do well at the end. Otherwise, I think we'll be disappointed that we didn't take a little extra time. Thank you. Thanks, Mr. Chairman.
Councillor Brunei.
Thank you, Chair McPherson, and thank you for allowing the second round of questions. On the presentation that our CEO and Mr. Bruder did, there was a tentative timeline, and under the 2020, there was the construction of the sanitary force main and the pumping station. So I just want to just kind of clarify where we are, because I remember, you know, during the early meetings 2 years ago, you know, when we were down with the Victoria Shores people and getting, you know, all the maps, you know, with everybody's comments, there was a lot of discussion about, you know, the upgrading that we'd be needing for pumping stations. And I recall at the time, you know, there was the discussion about the Laurie Street pumping station, but then there was also this discussion about a new pumping station. So I'm just wondering, as we sit here today, in reference to the concerns of those Victoria Shore people, where are we with, if we could identify both those pumping stations, Laurie Street and the new pumping station?
I can defer to staff if you
Yeah,
like.
maybe we can
Mike?
have Mr. Graham
Yeah.
make comment to that.
Thank you, through you, Mr. Chairman. So a bit of an update on the pumping station upgrade for the sanitary sewers. So the Laurie Avenue pumping station is a regional facility, Region of Niagara, and the force main that goes from the pumping station out across the highway. So as an update on that, that station is the station to be upgraded for a number of reasons. The timing currently, the region is doing the detailed design right now and looking at upgrading that pumping station and the force main that leaves the pumping station to be construction ready for 2020.
Thank you, Mr. Graham. And through you, Mr. Chair, just one other question. Mr. Arians, on page 14, when you were talking about the servicing of the site, the last item you referred to was the west drainage channel. And you referred to, you know, an L shape, you talked about a channelized area, and you talked about a naturalized area. So has this been completely vetted with the people of Victoria Shores? Like, I know, you know, we've been talking about this, but as we sit here today, this has been completely discussed through the public meetings, and you're confident that what you're proposing is going to be to the pleasure of the residents in Victoria Shores?
So to put it in perspective, where the cursor is now is where there's a box culvert. Okay, and there's a water that comes out of this box culvert, and there's a ditch that takes it over to here, and then here's an open channel going all the way and out to the lake, okay? This open channel will remain. It will be naturalized, it will be refurbished, additional plantings, and a trail will be added. We've said that all along. What we've done is we've expanded that buffer to now include this strip as well, but there won't be a channel in there because there's no channel there today. So the only part of the channel that'll be enclosed is basically this little part here going across our parking lot and outletting here. So this is the part that will be piped. It's a
Buried
ditch
pipe.
today. The open swale that's here will remain and it'll be restored and naturalized. The buffer function remains identical to our neighbors at Victoria Shores. The width of the buffer, the addition of a trail, the additional plantings is exactly as we've presented from day one, sir. So there really is no change to Victoria Shores with this little section of this existing ditch being put in a pipe.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome, sir.
Okay. Well, don't go away, because I've been patient here. So thank you, John and Angela, for the presentation, and, you know, it certainly is an exciting evening that we're here, you know, now at this stage in the project. You know, I did have some questions, so I may pull you back up here for, and first of all, some kudos to the design, going back to the full-size park along the waterfront. You know, I think that, you know, that's a absolute necessity to make this the destination that we've, you know, set out from the start for it to be. The add of the building in Councillor Bernay's question, from a mid-rise, I guess, adding that back in, I think is an absolute positive, and the add of the employment property or the employment building, again, I think is important. You know, that said, you know, I'm going to tell you that I think you nailed it back here. You know, that the plan you had back in, I think it was June of 17, you know, looking at, you know, a nice flow right across the whole property. You had your employment properties up in the southwest corner. You know, and I think there is, you know, some nice spacing there that you get because you've got those properties, that you don't feel congested, and you had lots of parking in there. Then you had your low to medium density, you know, in that sort of west side, you know, to accommodate the, you know, the requests from the folks at Victoria Shores to stay low. And then as we moved east, you know, of course, the downtown is fabulous, you know, and that is all, you know, exciting piece of it. And then we moved into some medium-rise, 6- and 8-story buildings that I think gave it a nice presence, you know, that as we were moving east, we were seeing a rise in the buildings. And it also, I'm going to tell you, I'm not a huge fan of a long row of townhomes, you know, and I think that brings with it some issues. You know, obviously, cars on the street, you know, parking, you know, that type of thing can take away from what is this destination that we you know, think we created. So, you know, and I understand what you're saying about market conditions, but again, you know, I think we got to be careful with that because, you know, we are building, you know, this place once. That's all we get to do. And you know, I'm not an expert on market conditions for real estate. All I can tell you is anything that seems to be going on sale in the town of Lincoln is flying off the market. So, you know, I think that we've got to be careful in, you know, when you look at that southwest corner, and now we've got, I don't know how many townhomes are up there, 50 townhomes on one long row or long street. And the other thing is, you know, again, the people that are investing in the downtown are going to rely on some of those employment lands to take care of them during the day. You know, so, you know, you get everybody leaving to go to work, you know, and where are those restaurants and those shops and those, you know, those people that are investing in that little downtown, you know, where are they going to get their support? So, and I think if you look at the numbers, and these numbers may be wrong. You know, I think we were talking at the start of somewhere in the neighborhood of 1,500 to 1,600 units. Maybe it got as high as 1,800 units, and then we had, you know, somewhere in the neighborhood of 4,000 or 5,000 people that were coming to the town. Now you're below 1,200 people, or 1,200 units, which to me, if you do kind of the same math, we're maybe at 3,000. So we lost 1,000 folks in that. So again, you know, I get it on market conditions, but I think we got to be careful, and you can't be building this thing and saying, oh, if we had to do it over again 10 or 20 years from now, would we have done something differently? This is the time to do it. So, you know, maybe that was my you know, lengthy comment. You know, one question I do have is with regards to the, actually I have two questions. One is with regards to the entrances, the streets coming on from the service road. And I think at one time we had 2 or 3 and there was a lot of discussion of how do we channel cars down Main Street? And now I'm seeing 6, is there 6 or 7 roads that actually enter the development?
Through, this is of course a private driveway connection directly opposite the signals at the interchange. This,
Private driveway for all those townhomes?
correct, and for the employment area. So this is a private road. This also is a private road primarily for the highway commercial and the back of the commercial area. We have one public street here, the Main Street. We have a second public street here and a third public street. So 3 streets and then 1, 2, 3 private road connections.
Well, call them private if you will. You know, what is the chances that somebody's gonna take that second private road to go back into this complex, the townhouse complex, as opposed to going down Main Street? I'm just, you know,
So
maybe
that-
putting the question out there.
So that was our concern, sir. You may recall that the secondary plan at this location proposed a road coming in right across here. And what we were very concerned about, with that being a public street, you've created a bypass to Main Street. We want the people to come in on the Main Street. That's
Yes, we
our
do.
entrance, that's our focal point, that's our gateway to Prudence. So having a series of private roads with traffic calming measures will deter that quick through traffic movement. So most of the traffic will be coming in the Main Street area, which is
Okay.
exactly where we want them to.
Okay, and thank you. Maybe a question for the staff, and really around complete communities. And you know, I know there's been some discussion about Jordan Park and you know how we enhance Jordan Park. But I'm thinking, looking at this particular plan, I'm wondering about town of Lincoln and how we bring people together in this community without having to drive, with, maybe taking a bike or walking. Is there any discussion around somewhat of a community building, community hub, anything that would provide for, who knows what, recreation, gathering point, anything along those lines? Mr. CAO.
Through you, Mr. Chairman, I think to answer your question specifically, members of council will recall during our development charges bylaw exercise, one of the provisions that we put within our development charges bylaw was and we have talked about it a number of times, was some sort of what we called, I think, community facility or community space down in the Prudhome's location in that commercial corridor. And that can take a number of, I think, different iterations or different looks to it. I think we've talked about making sure in the municipal service center concept, there's an ability for people possibly to go down there, possibly to pick up recycling containers, to pick up garbage cans, maybe to pay certain bills in that particular area. Tourism, economic development were other things that we had talked about. Some of those just basic amenities that people may want to walk to, because this will be a very walkable community. It'll be a community that people can access. So we've made that provision, both from a long-term financial sustainability perspective and a planning perspective. And Mr. Bruder reminded me earlier today that we have provided within the various zoning designations the ability to locate a facility like this in that area. So staff definitely have been thinking about that, and one of those things that we'll be working with council. Furthermore, I'd add to that, I think that connection to the Jordan Lions Park and the potential for redevelopment at that site, and how there's the connection with Prudhome's will be something that we'll also be bringing back to council, so that we can make sure that we've got the appropriate amenities to service that segment of our community.
Good, okay, thank you. So, at this time, are there any other persons present this evening to address Prudhomme zoning amendment and draft plan of subdivision? Please approach the podium and come forward, state your name and address, and spell your surname for the record. calling for a second time for anyone to approach council and speak to the public meeting item. I'm calling for a third and final time for anyone to come forward and speak to the public meeting tonight. As there are no more speakers, I declare the public hearing to address Prudhoe zoning amendment and draft plan of subdivision closed. Are there any questions from council? Seeing none, therefore no further discussion. We have a motion. And the motion is that council receive this report regarding zoning bylaw amendment application PLZBA 201-80149 and draft plan of subdivision application PLSUB 201-80148 in the name of Prudhome's General Partner, Inc. for information, and direct staff to prepare a recommendation report once all comments have been received and issues have been addressed. We will require a mover for the motion. Councillor Timmers. All in favor? Any opposed? And that is carried. Thank you. Our second public hearing is for the purpose of zoning bylaw amendment application by Kelly and Benjamin Van Hoffen. We have one delegation registered this evening. With respect to this public hearing, please note that each delegation may speak for a maximum of 5 minutes. Craig Rowe from Upper Canada Consultants speaking to item 5.2, PD-23-19, zoning bylaw amendment application by Kelly and Benjamin Van Hoffen. Good evening.
My name is Craig Rowe. I'm a senior planner with Upper Canada Consultants in St. Catharines. That is certainly a tough act to follow. It's a great project. It's always tough going after John. So what I wanted to do tonight was just provide a little bit of brief context. As you've seen the report, I think that there's some areas that maybe I need to clarify just a little bit about kind of the purpose of this application and give you a little better sense of why we're here and why this is a zoning amendment, which is one of our key questions that we have. So our application is for 4226 Queen Street in Beamsville. It currently has a zoning of RM1, which we're not proposing to change. What we are looking for is site-specific zoning to add on to that, and that's to permit an accessory apartment dwelling unit within an accessory structure. In this case, it'll be inside of a new garage on the second story, and we're asking for site-specific relief for accessory structure lot coverage. So there's a special set of provisions in the town's bylaw that actually governs the accessory lot coverage, as well as an increase in height over what's allowable for an accessory structure. So in our mind, we saw the lot coverage and the height increase. These are minor matters that could have gone to the Committee of Adjustment. The issue we ran into is that there's actually some clear wording in the town zoning bylaw that prohibits the ability to put an accessory dwelling into an accessory use, which is why we're before you with a zoning bylaw amendment. So just for some context, I think we have we have most of it works here. This is the property in question right now. This structure back here is currently a garage/barn that's set to be demolished. So this is Queen Street, and that's going out to Mountain Road, as you'll see right here. So here's the existing house, the existing garage, and then there's a hoop house that's on the back as well. Both these structures are slated to be demolished, and then you see Queen Street and Mountain Street here. This is the proposed plan that we have. So upon the demolition of those two structures, there'll be a new garage that's built, and above it, it will actually have an accessory apartment dwelling unit, and that's being constructed by the Van Hoffens for family that is set to move in there. And then this additional area here is a proposed covered deck, which you can see in this area. As it stands above the property, it counts to the lot coverage. This is actually what tipped us over on the lot coverage requirement. So, and it was really the height issue is the one reason that we're before here. But this is kind of the meat of the situation. On January 1st, 2012, there were changes made to the Planning Act, which is part of, I got the exact name of the act, actually. Let me just cite that for you. It's the Strong Communities Through Affordable Housing Act. And what that did is it was trying to prescribe new ways to accommodate intensification and alternative forms of housing and affordable housing throughout Ontario communities. So through the Planning Act, secondary residential uses became a permitted use, and those are to be permitted in both the primary dwelling and as well as in accessory dwellings. Local municipalities could choose how they govern them. They could require a site-specific zoning bylaw amendment, but you couldn't outright prohibit them. So in the Planning Act, that was to be translated, the local municipality, regional municipality would have to set forth policy direction that said how those were governed. So in the regional official plan, they're referred to as secondary suites, but the regional plan, because it doesn't currently govern local land use planning, they don't dictate where it has to be. That's deferred to the local municipality. So through your 2014 official plan update, you carried forward secondary residential uses. They're permitted both in the primary dwelling and in the accessory dwelling. But then we come to the zoning bylaw, which has not been updated yet, in that it has specific prohibition of an accessory dwelling in an accessory structure. So what we have is we have a disconnect between the zoning and the official plan. So it is our opinion that through the forthcoming update to the comprehensive zoning bylaw, that the change would likely be made that would allow for those accessory dwelling units to be allowed in accessory structures subject to performance criteria. And this is really why we're before you today. We feel that allowing this use would be in keeping with the intent of the official plan. That's in keeping with regional official plan policies, the Planning Act, and other provincial policies that apply, the growth plan and the PPS. And really, it's an appropriate use close to downtown, and it's really it's a very strategic way to use the property, especially for their current family condition, keep their family close by, but also they're in great proximity to the downtown. So we feel with the performance criteria being asked for, that being the coverage and the height, is actually quite minor, and that we would just ask that through this process that council consider that if the zoning bylaw was current, it would likely align with those overarching policies. So I'd be happy to answer any questions you have.
Thank you, Mr. Rowe. We have Councillor Rajima.
Thank you, Chair McPherson. Thank you for the presentation, and through you, Mr. Chair. So I'm totally in favor of the secondary dwelling unit. That's great. And I realize that provincial policy supports it, and that our intent is to support it as well. So how tall is the existing house on the property?
The house
Yeah,
or the barn? The house.
the house.
Through you, Mr. Chair, I believe it's about 11 meters. 11 and a half meters.
The house is 11 and a half meters, and the structure is proposed to be 10 meters?
The structure is proposed to be 10 meters, as the current zoning allows a new dwelling constructed, so a house could be up to 12 meters in height.
Mm-hmm. So the height of the accessory building will be lower than the height of the primary use on the property, which is residential?
Correct, and based on some measurements that we did this afternoon, the existing garage that is next door to it, just for some context, I think this is important. There we go. This structure here on the adjacent property is just over 8 meters tall, approximately, based on our measurement.
Okay, one more question for
Sure.
you, Mr. Chair. And so you said earlier on, I believe, that the proposed covered area, I think I'm looking on the plan, is 314 square feet. And were it not for that, you'd be able to meet the lot coverage provision? Is that true?
Through you, Mr. Chair, yes, if this covered deck wasn't there, we would meet the accessory lot coverage provision. But they would like to have the deck, so it's up to them.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair.
Seeing no other, Councillor Timmers.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, through to the presenter. The overall size of the building, I figured out was going to be 1,500 square feet. So are we looking at 750 on each floor?
We have it listed in the drawing here in square meters, so approximately 140 square meters.
So that equals 1,500 square feet total for both floors?
That would be for the footprint.
Right.
Yep.
Okay, and 32.9 feet tall is what I figured out. So it's going to be a very large structure.
Through you, Mr. Chair, We feel it's in keeping with the character of the neighborhood. Certainly as it's going to be recessed a little bit further back than the existing structures, the appearance from the road wouldn't be as brooding. We still consider it very compatible. One of the other caveats to the zoning on this property is actually the minimum setback is 1 meter. We've chose to keep it 7.5 meters away from the rear yard to ensure compatibility with the neighbors behind. So we could be much closer, and technically we could actually build a brand new house, 12 meters tall, around the back property line right over top. But we feel based on the position and that it's adjacent to the existing garage next to it, it is compatible and it's not gonna have a negative impact on anyone. We had the open house as well. We had no objections that were brought forward to our attention at the time.
So it shows 2 garage doors on the front of the new house. Is it gonna be cars parked in there?
My understanding is that that's going to be space that could be used to park cars, could be used for storage, but the accessory dwelling itself will be entirely on the second floor.
So it's not gonna be living space on the main floor?
No.
So it'll need its own water and sewer hookup?
Yeah, through you, Mr. Chair. It's actually quite convenient, the timing of the application. We understand that there's some road work that's going to be going on in the Queen and Mountain Road area. So in order to do these connections, we'd have to actually cut up through the driveway and establish those independent connections for the building. But we do have an opportunity to hopefully coordinate that work with the town and get those connections put in place and not cut up local infrastructure at the same time.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Chair, just through to planning staff, maybe to our Director of Planning. Could you just explain to me these accessory units compared to, like, we see granny flats, we see garden suites, and now we see accessory units. And accessory units in urban, whereas granny flats and garden suites are only in rural? Is that, am I correct on that? You could just explain
Okay.
what the rules are around it.
Through you, Mr. Chairman. So what's referred to as a granny suite, the planning or garden suite, those are usually what they call temporary structures, and the Planning Act allows somebody to place that on their property, subject to a zoning amendment, and then those are to stay for 20 years. So those could be in the rural area or in the urban area. We tend to see more of those in the rural area than we do in the urban area because properties tend to be smaller in the urban area. The Planning Act does provide, and the changes to provincial policy, they do provide for what we call accessory dwelling units. So in the case of this particular application, what the applicant could have done, instead of building a separate building, they actually could have done an addition to the back of their home as of right to do an accessory apartment. So they could have done it that way, whereas in this case, the applicants have chose to do a detached structure. So all of this is contemplated by current provincial policy. It's just our zoning bylaw process has not got caught up to date with some of the changes in policy.
So an accessory, just one more question, Mr. Chair. So an accessory unit would be permanent. There's no restriction. It can stay permanently.
Through you, Mr. Chair, yes, an accessory dwelling unit is a permanent second unit on the property.
Okay, thank you.
Councillor Patriva.
Yeah, thanks through you, Chair McPherson. Probably more of a question to staff. With respect to shading, looking at the picture the applicant provided, the house casts quite a shadow, and it's not the same distance to the property line as the barn currently. So that's going to come down. You're going to be replaced with a 10-meter structure. So how is that going to affect the property to the north with respect to shading?
Through you, Mr. Chairman. The property to the north also has a building, roughly right now it's in line with the existing building. So there actually is a building to the north, and if you look at where sunlight goes, usually you don't get as much shadowing, on the north side of a property as you would on the east, the south, or the west side because of the way that the sun moves around.
Are you good, Mr.? Patrick? Counselor?
I guess if the neighbors have no issue with it, I mean, I just, it's going to be awful, like, that's going to come down, and this is going to go up, and you see the shadow that's casting down, so I don't know. If the neighbor's fine, then I'm fine, but I don't want to be getting a call in 6 months that their backyard is now not usable, that it's in shade, so.
Well, we also have the opportunity for those to speak tonight, so.
Okay.
Okay. Counselor Mikulik.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Through you to the presenter. Just curious, it seems to be new that we're building basically a residence in the backyard of a R1 zone building lot. Is there ever any thought as far as fire service, servicing this residence should there be a fire and there's cars parked in that driveway, in those driveways? Do we ever worry about these places catching fire? It's similar to these condos or townhouses that are being built, and we're asking sprinklers to be installed, we're asking for a fire plan. Is there a fire plan should this structure catch fire?
Can I put that over to staff?
Certainly, through you, Mr. Chair. So, should this be approved, obviously, building permit needs to be applied for, and that's one of the criteria. When they come forward, what staff reviews is they make sure from a fire safety perspective that provision of adequate access to address whatever issue there may be in terms of a fire is provided. So that is a component that staff consider as we move forward.
And thank you. And the reason why I'm asking is because I see cars parked in the driveway in this picture, and should the cars be parked 2 and 2 and nobody's home, there's no, I don't see an access for the fire department to make it back there. I don't know if the planner has taken that into consideration or if it's ever taken into consideration.
Certainly, to echo staff's comments, this would be dealt with through the building permit stage. We're aware of the required separation that we have to have from adjacent uses. I think maybe just anecdotally on this, certainly the fire engine would likely, given its size, for the outriggers or anything like that, would likely not pull up right in the driveway. They'd probably pull out on the road, and they have the ability to run the hoses and do whatever they have to. Certainly, there'd be the requirement for working smoke alarms and everything to that effect. But I feel that maybe the question would be the same as if there was a shed on fire and you have 2 cars in the driveway. What would be the difference? It was.
Well, I think the difference would be that there's a garage or a barn next door that's going to be within, how many feet? Do we know? Excuse me, if you don't mind me asking, how many
Through you,
feet?
Mr. Chair, our required separation from the other garage to the north is 1.2 meters from the property line.
And that existing barn is, do we know how far that is from their property line, their lot line?
We do not have it shown on our survey plan with us, no.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Rowe. So at this time, are there any persons present this evening to address zoning bylaw amendment application by Kelly and Benjamin Van Hoffen? Please approach the podium and come forward, state your name and address, and spell your surname for the record. I'm calling for a second time for anyone to approach a council and speak to the public meeting item. And a third and final time for anyone to come forward and speak to the public meeting item. As there are no speakers, I declare this public hearing to address the zoning bylaw amendment application by Kelly and Benjamin Van Hoffen closed. Any further questions from council? Seeing none, there being no further discussion, we have a motion. That council receive zoning bylaw amendment application PLZ BA 201-90013 in the name of Kelly and Benjamin Van Hoffen for information, and that a recommendation report be prepared once all comments have been received and issues have been addressed. We will require a mover. Councillor Brunet, All in favor? I see all, and that's unanimous, so that is carried. Our third public hearing is for the purpose of the zoning bylaw amendment application by Kimberly and James Vermeyer. At this time, are there any persons present this evening to address zoning bylaw amendment application by Kimberly and James Vermeyer? Please approach the podium and come forward, state your name and address, and spell your surname for the record.
James Farmer,
Okay, James.
2675 Red Maple Avenue, Bahrmeyr.
All good, Trish? Good, okay, go ahead, James.
Just representing myself as a homeowner, so I apologize for lack of technical terms.
No
but
problem.
We're planning to build a garden suite for my aging parents in the north end of our property for a temporary use of 20 years. I'm not sure if we were supposed to bring the drawings.
You're good with what you've got.
Yes.
All right, so that's it? We'll just hang on there and see if there's any questions, okay? Are there any questions from council? Councilor Njima.
My question is through to staff. Is it appropriate to ask that at this time, Mr. Chair?
Depends on the question, I guess.
Pardon?
Go ahead.
Okay, so currently our zoning bylaw only allows for temporary secondary suites in this zone. I believe I read that in the report. The future is uncertain with the provincial review, but I imagine that when we update our zoning bylaw, we will incorporate regulations that accommodate more permanent secondary housing uses. How will this site-specific zoning amendment be viewed if it is approved as temporary? Will it be a legal non-conforming use down the road?
Through to Mr. Bruder or Ms. Dale.
Through you, Mr. Chair. So the intention is, I believe, this is going to serve as the kind of secondary suite for the applicant's parents for the time as that temporary use is allowed, so for the 20 years. Then ultimately, I believe, as I understand it, the use is going to be converted after that into an additional building or something like that, as this is located within the green belt. So what this would be is, whenever we have one of these temporary uses, we enter into a temporary use agreement, should this be approved, and that would be one of the conditions, is that following the 20-year period that this would need to be converted, because as per Greenbelt policy, following the 20-year period, it wouldn't be to be used for human habitation unless that temporary use got extended. So the building would have to be converted to a non-res use.
Okay, I can see, thank you. I can see that this is something we would want to see on a permanent basis, secondary units in this area. So I'm in favor of the application, and I was just curious, in the long run, how your site-specific zoning that you're applying for today would affect the property. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Vermeyer. Appreciate you coming forward. So I'm calling for a second time for anyone to approach council and speak to the public meeting item. Calling for a third and final time for anyone to come forward and speak to this public meeting item. We do have somebody coming. Welcome.
Thank you. Susan Hallport, Hallport. It's my first time too. Thank you. I have a house at 4119 Jordan Road. In the plans, as I see it, that were mailed, the road driveway that's being accessed to the garden suite was, there's no drawing, so it's kind of hard to say. As you can see, there's a building there, and to my understanding, to the drawings, it looks like the driveway would go down the side of what we'll call a large warehouse kind of building and go around to the back of where the garden house is. I don't know where the property lines are. I kind of feel like this road is unnecessary for the garden house. I think if these are his parents or elderly people, having the driveway that he already has access from the road would be plenty instead of encroaching onto the farmland next to him.
Okay. Do we have any comment to that question, or do we take it as input? Either or, can you comment?
Sure, Mr. Chair. So I mean, when we do these garden suites or temporary use agreements like these, typically one of the criteria is there can be no new access into the site, into the property. In this case, it's an extension back into where the proposed building would be. From a planning perspective, I don't necessarily see anything that's in contravention of any of our policies in that regard. If there was a new driveway going out to the road, that would be something different, something that isn't already there. That said, I could have subsequent discussions with the applicant about it moving forward.
In the drawings, can we have an explanation of the way the drawing looks for this roadway? Because I'm under the impression it was on the side of the building.
So do we have any?
Could show, that's all.
Through you, Mr. Chair, perhaps I could follow up and provide a little bit of additional information in this regard. We've already had a little bit of dialogue to this effect, so if you would, I'll follow up with you subsequent to this meeting to give you a little bit more detail.
Does that work? Thank you. Thank you for coming forward. Okay, I am calling for a third and final time for anyone to come forward and speak to the public meeting item. Seeing nobody. As there are no more speakers, I declare this public hearing to address the zoning bylaw amendment application by Kimberly and James Vermeyer closed. Any questions from council? There being no further discussion, we have a motion that council receive zoning bylaw amendment application PLZ ATU 201-90014 in the name of Kimberly and James Vermeyer for information, and that a recommendation report be prepared once all comments have been received and issues have been addressed. We will require a mover for the motion. Councilor Rajima, in favor? Those in favor, please. That is unanimous, and that is moved. I'm going to get through these public meetings before we take any kind of break, if that pleases the council. Thank you. All right, so our fourth public hearing is for the purpose of the amendment to the zoning bylaw, public uses. At this time, are there any persons present this evening to address amendment to the zoning bylaw, public uses? Please approach the podium and come forward, state your name and address, and spell your surname for the record. I'm calling for a second time for anyone to approach council and speak to the public meeting item. I'm calling for the third and final time for anyone to come forward and speak to the public meeting item. I see no speakers, so I declare the public hearing to address the amendment to the zoning bylaw public uses closed. Any questions from council? Seeing none, there being no discussion, we have a motion that council receive zoning bylaw amendment application public uses, PLZ BA 201-90015, for information, and that a recommendation report be prepared once all comments have been received and issues have been addressed. We will require a mover for the motion. Councilor Mayor Easton. All in favor? And that is unanimous. Our fifth public hearing is for the purpose of the Industrial Lands and Rural Areas Community Improvement Plan. At this time, are there any persons present this evening to address the Industrial Lands and Rural Community Improvement Plan? Please approach the podium, come forward, and I believe this is John Hack.
It is,
From
Mr.
Sierra
Chair.
Planning and Management, so welcome, John.
Thank you. So I just have a few comments in regards to this CIP as it relates to the statutory public meeting, and I will provide you, members of council, with that now. So this project, as you know, you have been following over a period of time, and we've worked through a range of matters. The Community Improvement Plan started as an industrial or employment lands CIP and became, as a result of discussion with town staff, a plan to include rural areas as well. The first to stimulate private sector industrial development on currently designated lands. The second to seek to improve the economy of the rural areas through diversification and value-added uses in line with what is the competitive advantage of Lincoln as it relates to agricultural-related tourism and other uses. We are moving really to the end of this process. We're now actually at the Public Information Center stage, so the statutory meeting. Thereafter, depending on the wishes of this committee and any comments from the public, we will finalize and take on board any comments from the Ministry of Municipal Affairs and Housing. That is the one window for any comments from any ministry in relation to this plan. The Community Improvement Project area, which is a key aspect of this, is the entire municipal area within the official plan boundaries, with the exception of the area that was subject earlier this evening to its own discussions, that being the Prudhome's area. It's also exclusive of the areas in inset A and B, which is a more complicated drawing, but includes all of the other community improvement plans which are currently on the books in the municipality, and there are 3 of them. So on those, there is the Beamsville CIP, Central Business District CIP, one for Vineland as well, and then a mixed-use and residential intensification CIP. And there may or may not be a future plan for Prudhome's, but as I said, that is outside of the project area for this community improvement plan. So in terms of the project area, everything is simpatico and is in place for running each of those 3 CIPs plus the new one that we're identifying. Very quickly about the areas, this came about because there were some changes to the zoning around the area of the intersection between the QEW and Ontario Street in Beamsville. Consideration given to the need to try and bring some of these industrial lands, some of which are smaller, a lot are smaller, back into play, and so the view is that it's a good use of public resources to try and stimulate some of this development. The intent is that there is a focus on industrial development as opposed to anything else that might come along on these lands. In the rural areas, what we're trying to do here is do what a number of other municipalities have done, so it's good economic development for the town to consider an appropriate scale of assistance to those kinds of uses that are definitely bringing the visitors to town, that are definitely investing in new and innovative and quite exciting agricultural activities, and diversification away from just the crops and the fruits, but into the things that really are defining southern Ontario in terms of some of its rural landscapes, craft breweries, cheese, the whole range of things that is sort of linked to bringing the buying public onto the land as well. In terms of the programs and the priorities, the industrial land CIP has but a few programs, but they will be, you can expect this is where the biggest ask will be. So a development charge reduction grant, we've capped that off at $60,000. That seems reasonable. As you implement the plan, you may wish to revisit these numbers, and that's quite acceptable to do so. A building permit fees grant as well, which again is a grant back to the equivalent of their building permit grants at a maximum of $15,000 per property. And then, should you need it, an industrial tax increment financing grant, which allows you to to grant back taxes that they pay to you as a result of the redevelopment of the property and the increased taxes that are paid. That one is one that you can treat that as foregone revenue as opposed to having to actually fund the development charge grant from reserves. So that's how that works. In the rural areas, a range of much smaller programs, rural signage and landscape. Again, that fits with the idea of helping entrepreneurs to be able to improve their signage and wayfinding for the visiting public, and frankly, just dress up some of the fronts of their properties. But it's capped at $5,000, which means if you gave them $5,000, they're spending at least $10,000. So that it might seem like a small amount, but you will get multiples for those dollars. In terms of the private investment relative to $1 of public investment, typically you might look for anything sort of 1 to 4 to 1 to 6 in terms of private to public dollars. A rural restoration and renovation and improvement grant, $25,000. I think you'll implement that with care and attention, because $25,000 is a healthy sum of money, and if it's going to go to a renovation, you probably want to be able to see the results of that renovation, as opposed to it being electrical wiring in a property or a roof that you can't see. So there's going to be some judgment that needs to be brought to bear on that, but that shouldn't rule out anything that is about renovating a viable property that meets your other public interest needs. And then a rural development charges reduction grant, should you need it. The anticipation is that there won't be many instances where there are development charges liable in the rural area, because that would constitute, in effect, a change of zoning. DCs, you get charged DCs where there is a change of use, not necessarily a change of zoning, and so there have been some instances where the view is that DCs are liable. Where that is the case and where it's still worth assisting them, we want this program to be on the books. Some smaller programs, planning application and building permit fees, again, for the right project, can help send a signal that you're open for business and you wish to help them. Similarly, a tax increment grant is an important opportunity, again, for the right kind of project, and I would just say, you'll use that where the assessed value and the actual taxes being generated make it worth your while to go through the process of offering that, because there is time and effort involved in staff and even legal counsel sometimes to make sure that those agreements are in place properly. And then the rural feasibility grant, I think you would use that very sparingly. Doing a grant, having a consultant do a study doesn't necessarily move projects forward, but if that meant that they actually went out and worked with a design group to come up with signage or wayfinding or things of that nature, that may be something that is more relevant. So treating that flexibly will ensure that I think it's a helpful contribution to the plan. I know it's been a busy evening, so I haven't raced through it, but I will, of course, take any questions from anybody.
And thank you, Mr. Hacken, for your patience this evening. Thank you for hanging in. Are there any questions from council? Councilor Rajima is first out. There
Thank you,
go.
Chair McPherson, and through you, do you know how many municipalities in Niagara have a rural community improvement plan or an agricultural community improvement plan in place?
I really should, but I don't have the number to hand. Actually, 0.
Zero.
It looks like it's 0, and I'm just picking that up from colleagues at the back there. So, but it is used around the province. Areas where there's where people do come to experience the agricultural area. So whether that's Prince Edward County, which has a lot of people going down to the emerging wine country, but just the whole tourist economy there. Even places like Manitoulin Island and lots of places in between, they're seeking to help the rural areas for those, whether it be someone having an artist studio or something. It's really part of their tourism plans. So in the context here, I don't think you're trying to help, the wineries necessarily, or the large-scale agricultural users, producers, and this plan will exclude anything that is helping them in terms of equipment and other things which are clearly linked to their primary job of producing and processing goods. But where it's an innovation, where it's diversification, that's the kind of thing that you can potentially help with this program.
So we're trailblazers in a way on this, and I think we should be. I think it's
I
good.
wouldn't know, but I've been told that you would be, yeah.
Sounds like it.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Councillor Pachariva.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, John, for staying, so I figure I should ask you a question. With respect to the rural CIPs, so if you take number 5, that makes you ineligible for 1 to 4 and 6?
Certainly the intention is that you would use kind of either or, because you are, at the back of your mind, you're trying
Trish.
to help, but you're trying to be, you know, have some level of fiscal responsibility. So if you give a grant at the back end, you're saying, for this project, we're comfortable giving taxes at the back end of the project once it's built, rather than trying to help them up front. So,
Okay.
yeah, I certainly see it as an either or. It'd have to be a very special case where you throw that much support to them.
Well, and so with respect to that, so, and then the other ones, so like 1, 2, 3, 4. So you can potentially apply for each of those, or does one, you know, does going to the trough once then say, okay? Because what's happened in the past with CIPs is that we haven't had that control, and
Yeah.
you know, you'll go 1, 2, 3, 4 times, and it's like, okay, so to me, CIP is for, I mean, this is rudimentary to my way of thinking, a brownfield. So it's something that's sitting there that you want repurposed. I get it, CIP. But open swath of land, then just, you know,
Yeah, no, it is, and if I
4 or
may-
5 times, I don't get that.
Yeah, through you, Mr. Chair. I think the devil's in the detail. If you can stand to look at the detail of some of what's in the protocols of the CIP, our language is quite careful that we're maxing out per property, things like that. I mean, you can layer on certain of these applications. You might have a study grant, which frankly I'm not the biggest fan of, but you could have study grants, and you could have planning fees, and then you could give some tax assistance and you approve in principle for that, and then, you know, 2 years later when it's built, they get it. But I think the whole point of the CAP, and the message would have to be in some of the evaluation that's done, is it's not an entitlement. You know, it's there to be used discretionary. There's no appeal procedure for, you know, your judgment about what they should or should not get. And all of these are maximums. So there's a little bit of marketing that needs to go with it. There's a little bit of conformity between the plans. Make sure that what we've said is the same as what's said in previous plans. And then evaluation needs to be exactly that. You know, you're using the public's money. So there has to be some pretty demonstrated cases for it to be used.
Great, thank you.
I think before we leave that, I think our CAO has a further comment to make on there.
Through you, Mr. Chairman, I think one of the things that tweaked in the councillor's comments to me is that competitive advantage piece. And I think when we look at CIP specifically this one, and I did review the Niagara Economic Gateway incentive program, and that applies to others, not ourselves in the region. But I think one of the key parameters that we look at when we're assessing CIPs is how do we attract that new business, that large-scale advantage? And when we're competing against other municipalities, is there those 1 or 2 things that can make the absolute difference when we're looking at attracting jobs? So I think, you know, when we start using these, when we come back to you with recommendations and we try to figure out how do we separate ourselves from maybe the county or someone else who's looking at attracting someone, what are those 1 or 2 pieces that we'd be able to bring to the table? So it's not just an automatic thing. It's one of those things that needs to go into a broader analysis when we look at how do we attract jobs, how do we bring jobs, how do we look at that prosperity quotient as a community.
Councillor McCulloch.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Through you to the presenter, just curious about the signage grants. Like, when I use the word, when the word grant is used, I like to see return on investment. And how do you quantify, how do you measure return on investment with regards to signage? And is there anywhere, can you name me a municipality that has a signage grant currently, and how is that being used?
Through you, Mr. Chair, there are quite a few, and we've written a few of these. And, you know, it started from, in our case, it started from doing straight facade improvement grants where, you know, get them to give you 3 quotes. Firstly, the town sort of approves the approach, pull off the vinyl cladding, resand refinish the brick, it's all good. There you go, that's definable. Then it morphed into, if you have a corner property or if you have a commercial property, maybe you want to put some signage up there. You have to, so it is quite well used, and the application here is in the rural areas, that it's used appropriately to help wayfinding and sort of commercial signage that's going to promote people coming to and having a positive experience of this little rural agricultural spot where they drive in and they get their, whatever it might be that they're purchasing. So you still have to, it is putting a bit of work on the officers that have to actually run it, but it's got to be their judgment, and there probably is a little bit of enforcement on this as well. You have to see the designs, you're not just going to approve someone putting out a bog standard design and going down to Home Depot and buying the lumber and up it goes. You want to actually make sure that it's effective. So when you have a grant of $5,000, for landscape improvement, if you're not careful, I agree with you entirely, you could see that spent just cleaning up a drainage ditch, right? So there's going to have to be judgment, but in the right circumstances, it is something that you want to have on the books. You just have to make sure you don't get 50 applications for people, this time of year starting to look at landscaping issues, and it really isn't something that's in the public interest.
And thank you. And through you, that's a concern that I have. This seems to be a pretty ambiguous, pretty vague grant. It's a grant. It's a gift of money equal to your contribution. I see returns on investments with other, facade improvements through MPAC reassessments being higher, that sort of thing. But this, to me, it just seems like a gift of money. And I guess, I'm supposing I'd have to trust staff and yourself as your professional opinion that this is a worthwhile way of attracting or, bringing forth business, right?
If through you, Mr. Chair, I think the reality is you have to trust staff to come forward with recommendations for any of these projects that is trying to marry economic development goals and the use of public funds for that with what they're seeing as some of these practical applications. So you're absolutely right that we need to have care and attention paid to it. And I would just say that it should not be the assumption you're going to carve out grants and just pay people to do what they should do privately. That's not it. There has to be linked to something more beneficial. And there are lots of other questions, like if you've got a viable existing use and they can't fund the improvements of the walkway to get people off the street and into their area where they sell goods to people, you have some real questions to ask. But if it's part of a larger program that they want to put together that looks like it's quite innovative and they're taking the lead, you could use this. The other way to control how these programs get used is to go through a process of assigning a budget and saying we're only going to put $20,000 to that. So at most we can select 4 projects. So it does put work on staff. I'm not averse to turning you want this in because you only want to do this once. You can turn these programs on and off as you wish. You don't have to go back to the ministry or to the public to do that. So, point taken. I think it's a case of how you want to implement it.
And if I may, Mr. Chair, one more question, possibly to staff, just with regards to that sort of budget or that the application. What's the planned application format, like with regards to a proposal, or would council would each request be brought to council, or would staff be handling that within themselves? Should there be 25, 30 applications all of a sudden with this signage grant?
Mr. Deanne.
Thank you, Chair. Through you to the councillor. We are currently in the process of working with Mr. Hack's staff on developing the applications for these CIP programs. So we will ensure that there are some stringent sort of guidelines in those application processes. And further to the description on page 34 of the CIP, for this specific rural area signage and landscape improvement grant, it specifically identifies that grant assistance will not be offered for landscape improvements only. So we'll make sure that those applications are quite innovative and designed. And furthermore, I'm going to turn it over to Kathleen. Thank you.
Through you, Mr. Chairman, so there are some existing community improvement plans in effect that do allow for, as part of your facade improvement or improvements to your property, there is a certain percentage you can use to improve your signage. There's also some existing programs for landscaping. I would have to say there hasn't been a lot of uptake for those types of applications. It's more, I think with this one, it's probably going to be things like development charge reductions, tax increment financing, maybe some assistance with application fees that you probably will see more of. Really, the whole purpose of doing, a signage and landscaping program is really just to beautify properties, because there are some properties out there that if they added a newer sign or added some more landscaping, the curb appeal would be much better.
Okay, that's all. Thank you.
Mary Stinton.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you. I guess we're getting down to the wire now, but there's still a few questions. One of the most important amenities for rural application is certainly an access to water. Have you considered at all, as part of the CIP, the ability of farmers to make application to support bringing a water line into their property?
Based on our, through you, Mr. Chair, and to you, Madam Mayor, I recall once we've been here through with the economic development plan that was done, and I know this has been something that you've been discussing as a pretty fundamental requirement to backstop some of the agricultural growth that you want to see in the community. The reality, and I think we've discussed this going through the CIP, is that the CIP has relatively limited resources. So it is not our anticipation that this would be, for any kind of major public investment. This is a plan for the private sector to take advantage of. In bygone eras, these CIPs were both calls to action for significant public infrastructure investment as well as private, but this one is not, and most plans are not now. As it relates to very large, potentially what I assume are quite large applications to get water brought onto a property, it's not beyond the realm of possibility, but the way we've written this plan, this is for things like agricultural diversification, rather than servicing improvements that would help their core business. So the short answer is no. Could you amend it to be that? I would say only do that once you have a clear understanding of the costing involved that you might have to undergo. Because remember, the CIP is municipal wide, so there may be some areas that you want to focus on more than others, for example.
So if you did that, through you, Mr. Chair, would tax increment formulas be the way to go? If a person's been, I'll just give you an example. If a farm is located on the south side of Number 8 Highway and there is no water, and there's a farm on the north side of Number 8 Highway that has water, and each properties pay the same rate based on their acreage, there's an equity factor there. Have you ever seen the tax increment grant formula used to provide some redress to those people that don't have any services but are essentially paying for what their neighbor has?
Short answer is no. We see the tax increment finance approach used pretty innovatively. So for anything that you wish to fund, you could use it. So if you wanted to recognize that there's no water, there's a need to put water in there, the cost of that would be an upfront cost of whatever cost that is, and to the extent the taxes are significant enough And that's a real question. You know, does it still make sense for someone to put money up front if they're going to get a trickle effect from their taxes? But that aside, you could in theory do it. The only thing I've seen, honestly, to respond to different levels of service are different tax rates. And you see that in municipalities.
Right.
So that's the short answer.
Let me just ask you about help houses, because there's quite a lot of burden now being placed on farmers in regard to the help houses and the improvements. So I'm just talking about the facades to fit with this. I think they're in here, but I tried to find them again and I couldn't. Are they part of this document?
Help houses being worker accommodations?
Yes.
I think the way we've conceived of it, probably not, because that's a core element of the business of growing, producing, and processing the product, as opposed to on-farm diversification. So what we've tried to do is try and keep control in terms of your exposure to applications, to try and use this effectively. Could you expand it to a special needs element? Absolutely, you could. You could identify certain things. Other municipalities do it. There are CIPs that we've just seen done in other parts of the GTA that are specific to things like seniors housing or a hotel. So you can certainly be surgical, but the language of this at the moment, I would say, is not designed for that.
And I think what I'm hearing you say is that you really need to be extremely clear about what it is that you're trying to achieve and what it means in terms of the overall costs over the long term.
Yeah, through you, Mr. Chair, absolutely. I think if there is a desire to extend to, as I say, special needs, strategic issues such as access to water, servicing of that kind, or things like particular issues like accommodations for workers you can do that by an amendment to a CIP that can say specifically for these items, we're going to couch what we're willing to do and what we're not willing to do and
Right.
add it to it.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Mr. Chairman.
So, thank you again, Mr. Hack, for bringing this presentation tonight. I think it's a important piece of our economic development strategy, and good of you and your firm for going through it in a fairly quick process and getting us a result. So thank you very much. So unless, Luke, you're going to speak, I am calling for a second and third and final time for anyone to come forward and speak to the public meeting. Seeing none, I declare the public hearing to address the Industrial Lands and Rural Areas Community Improvement Plan closed. Any further questions from council? There being no further discussion, we have a motion that council approve the designation of the industrial lands and rural areas as a community improvement project area, and that council approve the community improvement plan for the industrial lands and the rural areas, and that council approve a bylaw to designate the industrial lands and the rural areas as a community improvement project area in accordance with Exhibit 7 of Appendix A, and that council approve a bylaw to adopt the community improvement plan for the industrial lands and the rural areas once the bylaw designating the industrial lands and the rural areas community improvement project area is approved. And finally, that council approve the implementation of the industrial lands and rural areas community improvement plan as follows. A, that the town permit applications to be submitted commencing June 1st, 2019. B, that the following programs of the community improvement plan be implemented at this time. Industrial Development Charge Reduction Grant Plan, grant program. Industrial Tax Increment Financing Grant Program. Rural Areas Signage and Landscaping Improvement Grant Program. Rural Areas Building Restoration, Renovation, and Improvement Grant Program. Rural Areas Development Charge Reduction Grant Program, Rural Areas Planning Application Fees Grant Program, Rural Areas Tax Increment Financing Grant Program, and the region be requested to offer matching funding for the proposed industrial lands and rural area lands tax increment grant program. We will require a mover for this. Counselor Regima? All in favor? And that is unanimous. Now, I did mention that we would want to take a break, but and thank you, Mr. Hack, and we only have 2 reports to go, so I would ask for your support in carrying on, and let's get through them, okay? Does that make sense? If I get all in favor? Good. All right. So next is the consent agenda. We have come to the consent portion of the agenda, which has one item, item 7.1, PD-27-19, Proposed Regional Official Plan Amendment Number 15, Revised Official Plan Amendment Exemption Policies. Would any member like to remove this item from the consent agenda for discussion? Seeing none, we will require a mover for the motion to pass this item on the consent agenda. Councillor Pachariva will move. All in favor? And that is unanimous. I will read the motion that council receive their support for information and council advise the region that it supports Regional Official Plan Amendment Number 15. So we've already announced our mover, and we have support from the entire council. Next item is regular agenda. We are now considering item 8.1 PD-29-19 Community Improvement Plan Incentives and Summary of Applications. Any questions from council? Seeing no further discussion, we have a motion. The motion being council receive the Community Improvement Plan Incentives and Summary of Applications report, and council endorse that any future applications be required to choose one of 2 options as either the tax increment grant or the development charge reduction grant, and that council support discontinuing funding for medium-density housing in the mixed-use and residential intensification CIP. We will require a mover. Councillor Reimer. All in favor? All are in favor, none opposed, and that's carried. Confidential items, there are none. Staff remarks, do we have any staff remarks this evening? There are none. Do we have any committee remarks this evening? Seeing none, that's always a popular item on the agenda, it seems. There be no further business. Call this meeting adjourned at 8:43.